What if a single phone call could bring down the biggest hidden fortune in American history? What if one desperate man, thinking he was reporting a crime, ended up exposing himself as the phantom thief of billions? This is the story of Jimmy Jung, and it begins with a call that shocked investigators and unraveled one of the greatest cybercrimes of all time. On the stormy evening of September 13, 2019, emergency operators in Athens, Georgia, received a frantic 911 call. The voice on the other end was trembling, full of panic, as the caller insisted that his home had just been burglarized. The man identified himself as Jimmy Jung, a young entrepreneur well known around the city for his wild parties, expensive cars, and the kind of lifestyle most people only see in movies. But this wasn't about a stolen watch or a missing gadget. Jimmy claimed that $400,000 in cash and jewelry had been taken right from under his nose. The sheer amount shocked the officer on the line. $400,000. From a private home? This was no ordinary theft. Within minutes, patrol cars rushed to the address, sirens cutting through the heavy night air, as if they were racing not just to a crime scene, but to the opening chapter of a much larger mystery. When officers entered Jimmy's mansion, their confusion only grew. His home looked more like a fortress than a residence. State-of-the-art cameras covered every corner, motion detectors lined the walls, and laser-based alarm systems were wired to respond at the faintest intrusion. Yet somehow the thief had managed to walk in and out without leaving a trace. No alarms had gone off. No doors or windows had been forced. It was as though the intruder had simply appeared and disappeared into thin air. Jimmy, wearing a designer robe and still shaking from the supposed break-in, walked the officers through the house. He pointed to the safe, now empty, and repeated again and again how much had been taken. $400,000, gone in an instant. But the more the officers looked around, the more uneasy they became. The cameras hadn't captured a thing. The alarms had never sounded. The evidence didn't match the story. In the quiet corners of the living room, where the flashing lights of police cruisers reflected against glass tables and expensive art pieces, whispers began among the officers. Could this really have been a burglary? Or was something else at play? Jimmy insisted he was the victim, but as one officer later admitted, he looked more worried about being caught than about being robbed. The panic in his voice during the call, the exaggerated gestures, the way his eyes avoided contact, all of it added to the sense that the crime wasn't what it appeared to be. What none of them knew at that moment was that this call, seemingly about a stolen fortune, was about to set off a chain of events that would lead investigators into the dark world of cybercrime, into the shadows of the Silk Road, and into the recovery of one of the largest Bitcoin treasures in history. For now, though it was just a burglary report, a young man, a huge loss, and a house that seemed untouchable but had somehow been breached. But the truth was waiting to come out, and it would soon reveal that Jimmy Jung was not just the victim of a crime. He was sitting at the heart of one of the most astonishing criminal secrets the United States had ever seen, and it all started with that one desperate 911 call. The hours following Jimmy Jung's 911 call turned his lavish Athens mansion into a hive of flashing lights and quiet suspicions. Officers moved through every corner, examining walls, safes, and windows, but the evidence simply did not add up. The security system had been too sophisticated to bypass unnoticed, and the silent cameras showed nothing at all. It was almost as if the crime had been staged. Detective Harris, a veteran with a sharp eye for inconsistencies, studied Jimmy carefully as he gave his statement. The young man described the missing fortune in detail: cash, rare jewelry, and collectible coins, worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. He claimed it had all been stored in a hidden safe inside his home office. But as Harris noted, Jimmy was vague when asked about the origins of this money. He brushed off questions with quick explanations about business deals and investments, yet his answers carried the weight of rehearsed lines. Still, the procedure demanded that the case be logged and pursued. Officers photographed every corner, dusted for fingerprints, and filed reports, even though privately most of them doubted that a burglar had ever been inside the house. The following morning, news of the supposed burglary spread quickly through Athens. Neighbors whispered about the wild stories circulating, wondering how a man barely in his 30s could afford to keep such extraordinary sums of money at home. Some spoke of his endless parties and his love for showing off wealth. Others recalled how suddenly he had risen from an ordinary background into a life of expensive cars and designer suits. Whatever the truth was, people sensed there was more to Jimmy than met the eye. Investigators decided to dig deeper into his past. What they uncovered hinted at a life full of contradictions. Jimmy presented himself as an entrepreneur, Yet official records showed no thriving businesses in his name. He was not registered as the owner of major companies, nor were there clear income streams large enough to justify his lavish lifestyle. Instead, there were shadows, brief mentions of overseas trips, large unreported cash deposits, and connections to names long associated with digital markets operating in secrecy. Meanwhile, Jimmy grew restless. He called the police station frequently, demanding updates and urging them to find the so-called intruder. His insistence was unusual. Most victims of robbery remained shaken but cooperative. Jimmy, however, appeared desperate to keep the case active, as though ensuring the police continued to look outward instead of inward. Detective Harris began to consider a troubling possibility. What if the burglary never happened at all? What if Jimmy had fabricated the entire story, either to cover something up or to explain the disappearance of assets too dangerous to keep? Weeks turned into months and the investigation slowed. With no real evidence of forced entry and no suspects, the case began to gather dust. Officially, it was filed as unresolved. Yet for Harris, the memory of Jimmy's nervous eyes never faded. Something about the young man had felt wrong from the very beginning. 3 years later, that intuition would prove to be correct. Federal investigators, pursuing leads in an entirely different operation, would stumble upon a digital trail leading back to Athens. What they would discover connected Jimmy Jung not to a burglary, but to a staggering stash of hidden cryptocurrency linked to the notorious Silk Road marketplace. But back in 2019, none of this was visible yet. The officers packed up their reports, the neighbors stopped whispering, and life seemed to return to normal. Jimmy resumed his extravagant lifestyle, throwing more parties, showing off more luxury cars, and living as if the incident had been nothing but a strange and unlucky event. Yet beneath the polished surface of champagne glasses and flashing cameras, the truth sat waiting in silence. Jimmy's secret was far bigger than anyone could have imagined, and time was the only thing standing between him and exposure. By 2020, the Athens burglary had long since faded from headlines, but Jimmy Jung's name quietly resurfaced on the radar of a very different kind of investigator. The regional cybercrime unit, working in coordination with federal agencies, was tracing old, unsolved threads from the notorious Silk Road marketplace. Nearly 8 years earlier, in 2012, Silk Road had been hacked, and tens of thousands of bitcoins had vanished into the digital void. Despite countless investigations, most of that crypto fortune remained missing. A ghost in the blockchain. Agents assigned to the case followed digital wallets across continents, watching silent numbers move through encrypted channels. It was tedious work, like searching for footprints on shifting sand. But persistence finally revealed something curious. A particular Bitcoin address showed activity that matched old Silk Road transactions, and more importantly, that address appeared to connect back to a name they had not expected: Jimmy Jung. The discovery came almost by accident. 2 agents, attending what seemed like a routine inquiry at Jimmy's Athens home, noticed his laptop left open on the kitchen counter. They copied one of the wallet addresses saved on his device, intending to verify it later. When they compared it to their database, the match was undeniable. Jimmy was not just a wealthy young man living beyond his means. He was potentially holding part of the missing Silk Road treasure. From that moment, the tone of the investigation shifted. What had once been an unsolved burglary worth hundreds of thousands was now a possible key to billions. The unit moved quietly, avoiding any tip-off that might alert Jimmy. Weeks were spent analyzing his bank statements, cross-checking his travel records, and following his online footprints. Every clue seemed to circle back to the same reality. Jimmy's fortune had no legitimate foundation, yet Jimmy appeared completely unaware of the walls closing in. He continued to host extravagant gatherings, post lavish photos on social media, and brag about his supposed success in cryptocurrency trading. Friends admired his charm, neighbors envied his lifestyle, and no one realized the extent of the storm forming in the background. For the investigators, the challenge was timing. They needed undeniable evidence before moving forward. Suspicion alone was not enough to justify a warrant on the scale required. So they waited, building their case with patience. Surveillance was placed on Jimmy's residence. His communications were quietly intercepted, and his digital patterns were studied in minute detail. One evening, during a discreet operation, agents managed to capture a critical piece of information. Jimmy logged into one of his cryptocurrency wallets, transferring a small portion of Bitcoin. That single transaction was enough to confirm the link between him and the massive Silk Road hack. The evidence was now more than circumstantial. It was a direct line. Back at headquarters, excitement mixed with caution. If Jimmy truly held the stolen bitcoins, it meant billions were hidden somewhere, and the recovery could mark one of the largest financial seizures in U.S. history. But where was the stash? The addresses showed signs of activity, yet the majority of the fortune remained untouched, locked away behind layers of digital secrecy. Meanwhile, Jimmy remained confident. To him, the burglary years earlier had been the perfect distraction. He believed that by reporting the theft of $400,000, he had created a convincing story to mask his deeper secret. What he did not realize was that his own arrogance, his insistence on wealth and visibility, was the very thread investigators were pulling to unravel everything. By late 2020, the agency had gathered enough for the next step. A search warrant was being prepared, one that would authorize a full-scale raid on Jimmy's home. What they expected to find was unclear, but every agent involved knew the stakes. Hidden in that house or somewhere nearby could be the answer to a mystery that had haunted law enforcement for nearly a decade. As the final paperwork was signed and surveillance continued into the quiet nights, Jimmy Young celebrated yet another weekend with champagne and laughter. He was still untouchable in his own mind, still living as though nothing could ever reach him. But his days of freedom were already numbered, and the clock had begun ticking down. The morning of the raid began quietly, as most decisive operations do. Federal agents gathered before dawn, their briefing rooms filled with photographs, blueprints, and laptop screens glowing with data. At the center of it all was Jimmy Young, once seen as nothing more than a reckless party boy, now suspected of holding billions in stolen cryptocurrency. The operation had been authorized at the highest levels, and for many of the agents in the room, this was the moment they had waited years to see. By 6 a.m., unmarked vehicles rolled toward Athens, their engines humming softly in the early light. The plan was simple in outline, but delicate in execution. Secure Jimmy's property, seize his digital devices, and locate the suspected wallet tied to Silk Road. Every step had to be precise. Any mistake could mean the permanent loss of an unimaginable fortune. At 7:15 a.m., the team moved in. The suburban calm of Jimmy's neighborhood was shattered as agents surrounded his mansion. Knocks turned into commands and commands into force. Jimmy, groggy and bewildered, appeared at the door in a t-shirt, his confidence collapsing into shock as he realized this was no routine visit. Inside, the house was quickly secured. Agents spread across rooms, cataloging everything. Computers, phones, flash drives, even handwritten notes. Jimmy's protests were loud but powerless. The warrant gave the team complete authority. While some officers interviewed him in the living room, others began the meticulous search that would soon reveal what he had fought to conceal. For hours, they scoured his property. The office safe contained nothing more than petty cash and documents, far too small to explain his hidden fortune. Bedrooms and closets turned up luxury watches, designer clothes, and imported liquor. But still nothing that tied him directly to the missing billions. Suspense thickened. Had they miscalculated? Was the true evidence hidden somewhere else, far beyond their reach? Then, in the pantry, an agent noticed something odd. On an ordinary shelf, between snack boxes and cereal bags, sat a bright orange container of Cheetos. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than junk food left behind by a careless host. But when the agent lifted it, the weight felt unusual. He shook it gently. The sound was wrong. Curiosity turned into procedure. The container was carefully opened, and inside was not chips, but a neatly folded towel wrapped around a small metallic object. The object was no ordinary gadget. It was a specialized hardware wallet, the kind used to store cryptocurrency offline. The room grew still as theorization sank in. This could be the key to unlocking the Silk Road fortune. The device was logged, sealed, and rushed to the digital forensic team on site. Within hours, they confirmed what everyone had hoped. This was Jimmy's vault, and inside were over 50,000 bitcoins. At the 2020 market value, the stash was worth an astonishing $3.5 billion. Gasps and quiet exclamations filled the command center as the numbers lit up on screen. Years of frustration and dead ends had finally led to this. An orange snack container hiding one of the largest crypto hoards in history. Jimmy sat silently as the agents revealed what they had found. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced with a blank stare. In his mind, the game had always been in his favor. He believed the authorities would never find his secret. Yet here it was, Discovered in the most ordinary corner of his home, sealed inside a container designed for chips, the raid concluded with Jimmy in handcuffs, escorted out of the mansion while neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering in disbelief. To the outside world, it seemed like a sudden fall from grace. But to the investigators, this was only the middle of the story. Recovering the bitcoins was one thing. Proving the full scale of his crimes would be another. As Jimmy was driven away in silence, the sun rose higher over Athens. For the agents, victory tasted sweet, but the case was far from finished. The true battle, tying Jimmy to Silk Road and securing a conviction, was just beginning. The hours following Jimmy Jung's arrest unfolded in the sterile silence of a federal interrogation room. The walls were bare, the lighting harsh, and the air thick with tension. Jimmy sat chained to the table, staring at the reflection of himself in the metal surface. His mind raced, but his options were narrowing by the second. The weight of what had been found in his pantry, the Cheetos container holding billions, was undeniable. Across the table, 2 federal agents entered with folders thick with evidence. They didn't shout, nor did they threaten. Instead, they laid out the case piece by piece. Bank statements, travel records, Bitcoin transactions, and finally, photographs of the orange container itself. Every page brought Jimmy closer to a truth he could no longer deny. At first, he resisted, clinging to a rehearsed story. He claimed he was only a crypto trader, that the wallet didn't belong to him, and that someone else must have planted it. But the agents knew better. They reminded him of the 2019 burglary call, the desperate 911 plea about losing $400,000. Why would a man who claimed to be so rich be so frantic about a fraction of what they had just discovered? The contradiction was glaring, and Jimmy had no convincing answer. Hours passed. The silence became unbearable. Finally, Jimmy exhaled deeply, his voice low and tired. He admitted the truth. Yes, he had used Silk Road. Yes, he had found a loophole in the system that allowed him to withdraw bitcoins that weren't his. And yes, he had hidden them away, waiting for their value to rise. But what stunned the agents was his final admission. He had distanced himself from the billions because he feared being caught. That was why he staged the 2019 burglary call. By reporting a theft, Jimmy believed he could explain away any missing funds, creating a distraction that might shield him from suspicion. Instead, the call had planted the first seed of doubt in investigators' minds, a seed that eventually grew into the full case against him. Once the confession was recorded, the story exploded across the media. Headlines screamed of the billion-dollar Bitcoin heist, and Jimmy's name became synonymous with greed and deception. Neighbors who once envied his parties now spoke of betrayal. Friends distanced themselves, claiming they had never really known him at all. Inside the courthouse, preparations for trial moved swiftly. The prosecution built its narrative carefully. Jimmy was not simply a careless party boy who stumbled into wealth. He was a manipulator who had stolen from one of the largest underground markets in history, hiding his fortune in plain sight while the world searched for answers. Defense attorneys, however, painted a different picture. They argued Jimmy was young, reckless, and caught in a web of digital confusion. They claimed he had never fully understood the magnitude of what he had done, that he was guilty of mistakes, but not of masterminding a grand heist. The courtroom atmosphere grew tense as the case drew national attention. Experts in blockchain and cybercrime were scheduled to testify, while financial analysts prepared to explain just how enormous the stash of 51,000 bitcoins really was. Reporters filled every available seat. Cameras clustered outside the courthouse, and the world watched closely, waiting to see how justice would respond to a theft of such unprecedented scale. For Jimmy, the nights were the hardest. Alone in his cell, he thought back to the reckless decisions that had led him here. The night he made the 911 call, the arrogance of flaunting his wealth, and the belief that he could outsmart everyone forever. Now, with the weight of his confession on record and the trial looming, he realized his empire of secrets was collapsing faster than he could ever rebuild it. The trial date was set. The stage was ready. And Jimmy Jung, once untouchable in his own mind, was about to face the full weight of the justice system. The courthouse in Athens had never seen such a spectacle. Reporters crowded the steps from sunrise, their cameras flashing at every lawyer, every federal officer, every passerby who might know something about the man now standing accused of one of the largest financial crimes in U.S. history. Jimmy Jung, once known as a carefree party boy, was escorted into the courtroom in a tailored suit, his wrists free but his eyes heavy with the weight of his situation. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Journalists scribbled notes furiously, law students filled the gallery for a chance to witness history, and ordinary citizens lined up outside hoping for a glimpse of the man who had hidden billions inside a Cheetos container. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, every murmur silenced as the judge entered and called the proceedings to order. The prosecution wasted no time establishing its case. A lead federal prosecutor stood tall, laying out a timeline that stretched back nearly a decade. She explained how Silk Road had been hacked in 2012, how 51,000 bitcoins had disappeared, and how years later, a young man in Georgia had suddenly begun living far beyond his visible means. She showed the jury photographs of Jimmy's mansion, his cars, his extravagant parties, and then, finally, the infamous Cheetos container. One by one, expert witnesses were called. A blockchain analyst carefully explained how Bitcoin transactions could be traced despite attempts to conceal them. Another expert revealed the undeniable link between Jimmy's wallet and the stolen Silk Road funds. The jury listened intently, some bewildered by the technical jargon but all aware of the magnitude of the crime. Jimmy's defense team countered with passion, if not with substance. They argued that Jimmy was a victim of circumstance, a reckless young man who had been swept up in a digital world he barely understood. They claimed the bitcoins were not proof of deliberate theft, but the remnants of failed investments, chance discoveries, or even mistaken identity. But their arguments seemed to weaken under the crushing weight of hard evidence. Through it all, Jimmy sat quietly. At times he leaned toward his attorneys, whispering strategies, but often he simply stared ahead, his face a mask of calm hiding the turmoil beneath. He remembered the nights when he had believed himself untouchable, sipping champagne while numbers in his digital wallet silently climbed into the billions. Now those same numbers were being displayed on screens before a jury, stripped of secrecy and transformed into evidence of crime. As the trial days stretched into weeks, the emotional toll deepened. Former friends were called to the stand, testifying about Jimmy's sudden wealth, his strange evasions about where it came from, and the parties that seemed designed to distract from uncomfortable questions. A former girlfriend admitted she had once asked him directly about his money, only to be brushed off with vague stories of Bitcoin trading. Each testimony tightened the noose. The climax came when the hardware wallet itself was presented. Under strict security, the device was connected and verified in court. The jury saw with their own eyes the staggering balance it contained, frozen yet undeniable. Gasps filled the courtroom. The reality of Jimmy's actions was no longer abstract. It was tangible, glowing on the screen in numbers too large for most people to comprehend. Closing arguments followed. The prosecution declared Jimmy a manipulator who had stolen from the shadows and lived in arrogance until his own mistake exposed him. The defense pleaded for leniency, portraying him as misguided rather than malicious. When the case was finally handed to the jury, the room fell into silence. Jimmy sat motionless, his fate hanging in the balance. For the first time, he felt the crushing truth of his situation. No party, no car, no amount of hidden wealth could save him now. The courtroom's silence stretched long, broken only by the sound of the judge's gavel as the jury retreated to deliberate. The jury deliberated for hours, their voices muffled behind the thick wooden doors of the chamber. Outside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Reporters refreshed their notes, defense attorneys whispered strategies, and federal agents leaned against the walls with quiet confidence. For them, the evidence had been overwhelming. Still, no one could predict the final words that would determine the rest of Jimmy Jung's life. At last, the doors opened. The jurors filed in silently, their expressions unreadable. The judge called the court to order and everyone rose. Jimmy stood too, his hands clenched tightly at his sides, his eyes fixed on the floor as if refusing to acknowledge the crowd watching his every move. The foreperson handed the verdict slip to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. The silence was so deep that every shuffle of paper seemed like thunder. The judge read the words clearly, his voice steady. Guilty on charges of wire fraud, guilty on charges of concealment of assets, guilty on charges of laundering of stolen cryptocurrency. A wave of sound rippled through the room, gasps, murmurs, and the frantic scratching of pens from reporters. Jimmy closed his eyes briefly, his expression betraying the faintest flicker of defeat. The empire he had built on secrecy and arrogance had finally crumbled, but sentencing was yet to come. The prosecution pressed for a severe penalty, arguing that Jimmy's theft was not just financial but moral, that he had undermined trust in digital systems and profited from a loophole that hurt countless others. That offense pleaded for leniency, insisting Jimmy had cooperated once confronted and that much of the fortune had been recovered intact. In the end, the court settled on a sentence that shocked some and angered others. Jimmy Young was sentenced to 1 year and 1 day in federal prison. It seemed almost insignificant compared to the billions he had hidden, but legal experts explained that the narrow charges of wire fraud carried limited sentencing guidelines. The larger victory for the government was the recovery of the bitcoins, valued at over $3.5 billion. The media erupted with the story. Headlines declared the fall of Jimmy Young, the man who had once tricked the world into believing he was simply a reckless playboy. Now he was forever tied to one of the largest digital heists in history. For weeks, television panels debated whether his sentence was too light, while economists marveled at how a container of Cheetos had become the unlikely hiding place for a treasure that once eluded the FBI. Inside prison, Jimmy lived quietly. Gone were the parties, the cameras, the friends who once clung to his wealth. Instead, he faced the long hours of solitude, replaying in his mind the single mistake that had led to his downfall, the 911 call back in 2019. Had he never picked up that phone? Had he never tried to stage a burglary to explain away missing cash, he might still have been free, living in luxury with the fortune at his fingertips. By 2023, Jimmy was released, his sentence served. But his freedom was hollow. The bitcoins were gone, seized by the government. His reputation was ruined, his wealth stripped away, his name permanently etched into the history of financial crime. He returned to a world that no longer admired him, a man marked not by success, but by scandal. The case of Jimmy Young left behind more than a headline. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how greed blinds even the cleverest minds. The very arrogance that convinced him he was untouchable had also pushed him to make the call that doomed him. And so, in the end, Jimmy's empire did not collapse because of brilliant investigators or high-tech tools. It collapsed because of his own mistake, a single desperate act that set off a chain of events too powerful to stop. His story stands as proof that no secret lasts forever, and that even the most carefully hidden crimes eventually come to light. If you enjoy these stories, make sure to subscribe to Black Battlers so you never miss the next one. Your subscription gives us the power to bring you even more emotional and inspiring stories. Join the Black Battlers family today.